Stephen Petty is joining me today to talk about the train derailment in East Palestine. And it's been a month since this news broke, but we're just starting to hear about this headline. 7 CDC workers fell ill investigating the train derailment. Stephen, you were there when it was even worse, you were saying, compared to the time frame that these workers were reporting. So my first question for you is, did you get sick, and are you surprised by this news?
Um, well, first, I'm not surprised by the news. Just by way of reference, the derailment occurred on the 6th. The fire on where they exploded the vinyl chloride cars the derailment occurred on the 3rd, February 3rd. The explosion or the burning of the cars occurred on the 6th. I was there from the 21st of February to the 4th, and they're reporting symptoms on the 7th. I had 2 staff with me that reported similar symptoms. I was sometimes in a respirator, sometimes not. We were so crazy busy sampling that at times there were so many things on my mind that I didn't pay much attention to it. But we heard many residents complain about these symptoms.
In the article, they talk about what the CDC investigators dealt with, and it sounds like headache, sore throat, coughing, nausea. And they say the symptoms are consistent with what some residents and responders have reported in surveys that the CDC has been conducting in and around the town. When I read this article, though, they do have a mention of a line towards the end about potential serious problems like rare cancers. Most of it's like, yeah, okay, coughing, nausea, headache, sore throat, whatever. They got over it. They're fine. That's what they say. They got over it. Everybody's fine. It seems to downplay the issues. Do you find that that's been something that you have come across as you've been investigating this? The I don't know, the minimalization, I guess, of some of the concerns that the residents have had.
Yeah, both the railroad and the governmental officials very early on. In fact, they told the residents as of February 8th, the day or two after the burn, that it was fine to go back to their homes. And I made public statements in town halls during February that my opinion was that decision was premature in the sense that we hadn't analyzed for enough chemicals to know whether or not that was true. It could be true or it could be false. Mainly because what they were sampling for at the time, in my opinion, without going into all the chemistry, were things that you wouldn't expect to find be indicators of whether there's a problem or not. And then the other factor was they said, well, see, we drank the water and the water's fine. Well, most of these contaminants would take some time to percolate through the ground and get into the aquifers, which move something like 1 to 10 feet a year, and then get to the wellhead. So you wouldn't expect to see it unless you were getting water from a stream, surface water from a shallow well. You wouldn't expect to see it show up in the well water right away, or the public drinking water, because it takes some time. I told the residents they should be sampling every 6 months to a year to see if it shows up. But I thought it was a little misdirection to take a sip of water. One, you're not there very long like the residents are, where they drink it all the time and they aren't showering it, etc. And then secondly, it probably isn't there unless there's a shallow well or a surface water that you're using. But more importantly, they hadn't sampled for a lot of the chemicals of concern that I had, including the big one, dioxin, which was a known combustion product, albeit at low quantities, from combustion of vinyl chloride. And more importantly, the very first car that derailed and was burning, turns out that it was polyvinyl chloride, which is sort of like vinyl chloride hooked together or polymerized. And that is well known to emit dioxin as a combustion product as well. So the problem with dioxin is it's one of the most toxic substances known to man. It was in Agent Orange as a contaminant, and you only have to look at 1982-83 Times Beach, Missouri, to see what happens if it's found. And I told the residents, I hope we don't find it, but we're obligated to look. And so we started, to my knowledge, we were the first group, the people that I was working for. I asked to be able to sample for dioxins. We arrived on the 20th. I asked on the 20th to do that. And on the 21st of February, we started sampling for those, and we finished sampling for those on the 4th. To my knowledge, nobody else had sampled to that point for dioxins. And in fact, to answer your question, the EPA had kind of, in my words, poo-pooed sampling for dioxins, saying, well, we can't do it because of background from gas or from grills and other things, which I thought was completely nonsense. But the reality was, I hoped I didn't find it, but since it's toxic at very low levels, that was the obvious thing to look for.
Okay, since you brought up the list of chemicals that the USA Today article, anyway, has cited were in the train cars, they say that according to a letter from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to Norfolk Southern, the chemicals included vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, if I'm saying this right, ethyl acrylate, ethylene glycol, monobutyl ether, and isobutylene. How'd I do?
Pretty good. Close. And we sampled for all of those in the water, sediments, and soil. And to some extent in the air. Less so in the air because by the time we got there, it had been a couple of weeks, so the plume was long gone, and there were many heavy rain events. So I told our folks, we're going to find it in surface waters and surface soils. So that's what we focused on.
Well, the reason that I wanted to bring that up real fast, Stephen, is because they have a link here to see the letter from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to Norfolk Southern about the chemicals in the train cars. And when you click the link, this is what you get. Not found. So I have no idea what happened to it. I guess I'll just leave people to their imaginations about that.
Yeah, I got a call on the February 15th or so, asking if I would be willing to go up and sample on behalf of residents and stuff, and be an independent person to do that. And the very first challenge was to figure out what to sample for, right? And then to make sure I had the right containers, the right methods, the right storage, et cetera, and the right labs. And so that was a challenge, but I did have, and I sent you a document that maybe that's what they were referring to, but
I'm going to pull that up in a second, but yeah, I just wanted to tell people that, I don't know if they got pressure to take it off or what happened.
Yeah, there was nobody telling me what to sample for, and that was a bit of a challenge. And I told the folks that this is a bit of guesswork based on 40 years of being, a scientist in this area. So anyway, I think it turns out we did we sampled for the right things, but that was one of the very first difficult things, was to figure out what to sample for, and neither the EPA, local or federal, nor the railroad were super forthcoming in terms of what they thought the emissions were, particularly on the combustion of vinyl chloride. But one can look that up in the literature, which I did, to find out what to sample for.
And like I said, yeah, I'll pull that back up in a second. Just a heads up to everybody who's watching somewhere besides Locals. If you go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com, you can be in my live chat, which I prioritize over there for supporters because they help me stay in business. AllisonMorrow.locals.com, $5 a month to go one-on-one with the most censored people on the internet. And there's lots of questions about what you found. Again, people get to put in questions ahead of time for interviews. So consider going to AllisonMorrow.locals.com and become part of my small but mighty editorial board. Stephen, before we continue, I just want to give a shout out to my sponsors, AllisonWinePromo.com, where you can get some of the best wines on the face of the earth, in my opinion, of course. These are high altitude, in fact, extreme altitude. One in the middle, 80, close, 8,200. Okay, not 80,000 feet. That would be pretty high. That would be pretty high. But it's going to feel like that when you drink it, because you're going to feel like you've never had a wine like this before. And in addition, if you're already a wine drinker, it's wine with a purpose. You help keep people like Stephen coming on my podcast, and you get a great glass of wine to drink while you're watching. You get 50% off the wine itself and 50% off shipping. And like I said, these are unique wines. You're not going to get them at the grocery store. Why would you want to anyway? The one on the left, the Rogue Malbec, is from hand-harvested grapes. Like I said, the one in the middle, from 8,200 feet. I just went skiing at 6,000 feet. These are way higher than that. Imagine being a grape and the hard work you put into the wine as a grape at that elevation. And the one on the right is named after the Cowboys of Argentina. So all the Cowboys out there, go get yourself some cowboy wine. AllisonWinePromo.com. You can also go to TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison. and get some amazing organic roast from Nicaragua. There are light roast, there's dark roast, there's also a Katura tea that is tea made from the coffee fruit. I like to cold brew mine. It's very good. Tastes a lot like a black tea. Low caffeine, high antioxidants. Also, the coffee roast here, there's quite a variety to choose from. I drink this every morning with my raw milk latte. It's my espresso, and just had one this morning. Actually, I am putting vanilla and almond extract in with raw cocoa, so I call it my mocha amaretto espresso latte. So go check it out at twinenginecoffee.com/Allison again. And thanks to my sponsors for keeping me in business. So let's go back to the locals chat, where the question was, after you were talking about what you were sampling for, and I think this is like the big question, what did you find?
I'd like to step back. I apologize for doing that, but you were asking about the health symptoms that were reported there by the workers. And there's really chemicals, especially by the EPA, tend to be classified in two bins. One where you have acute exposure, acute effects, which means they happen sort of instantaneously within a day or so. And then the chronic effects are effects like cancers and things like that, which take longer to show up and shorter exposure. So and to answer your question, I have to be careful what I say because we haven't gotten all the results in and we still haven't analyzed them to know exactly what they mean. But I can say that for almost all the components that you're seeing there, we have found them. The question is, are they at levels that are a problem or not? And in fact, that's the analysis I'm doing today before we came on board. So I was doing an analysis of the dioxin results, for example. So it's just like I think it's appropriate as a scientist that I don't give sort of preliminary results until we make sure we've looked at this data and made sure that it's right in our analysis. So we do have the data. We have a month's worth of we have data from the time I was there pretty much in February through early March. And I would say we have 80% of it in. And now it's up to me to look at the data and try to figure out what it means. But we have had hits on almost all those chemicals.
Okay, and again, this is the list that I was trying to show that originally was on the web for people to look at, that USA Today was linking to, but apparently does not exist anymore. So these are the list of the chemicals. Stephen, as an environmental reporter, former environmental reporter back when I was in Seattle in television news, one of the things that I hear a lot as these debates about contaminants were ongoing is you're blaming us for something that was already there. Is that something that's coming up in this conversation at all? Hey, you're blaming us for something that was already there, especially if, we don't necessarily have the levels back that you're talking about that might show that there were recent injections, I guess, into the environment. Is anyone talking that way?
Yeah. And in fact, that's one of the things we got to look for as well and make some determinations. But to give you, you mentioned this before, and not to pick on the EPA too much, but I've gone through and looked at their various comments that are on video on the record regarding sampling for dioxin, which I started on the 21st. They finally said on the 2nd or 3rd of March that they would start looking at it. But here's the comments that were said by Deborah Shore of EPA. We don't have baseline information for dioxins. They are ubiquitous, meaning everywhere in the environment. They can be caused by wildfires, by backyard grilling, by a host of other normal activities in human life. And without that information, it would be hard to attribute any level to the derailment. Part of that statement's true and part of it's false.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are background levels. But as I said to someone, I said, let's put the picture of a grill next to that plume and see if you think one affected the other. I said,
it's those dang gas stoves, man. You got it.
Yeah, even if they're charcoal grills, I mean, come on already. So,
it's all the tailgating. It's all the tailgating in honor of Ohio State football. Gosh, if we didn't have that crappy local college team, we wouldn't have these problems with all these contaminants.
Especially in rural East Central Ohio.
Yeah.
Interesting. I grew up and went to school in Seattle. So.
Oh yeah, the EPA, man. Funny,
So
funny, funny, funny people.
it was odd that they were seemingly more supportive of the railroad than they were of the community, at least at first. Now they've they've started to do some more sampling, but even there, I won't go into it. I think the sampling that they're doing is fatally flawed, but I will leave that for another day.
The EPA, perhaps, maybe you'd like to talk about this. I guess I'll leave my opinion out of it for now, but there is a lot of, this is fact, as a former reporter and just having interviewed PIOs and folks at the EPA, there is a lot of sensitivity around saying anything that could get them in trouble with big industry. And so they will, in my opinion, this is now my opinion, they will default to benefit of the doubt. And I've sat in courtrooms for several cases related to the railroad industry. In one in particular was related to fly ash. I don't know if that's the right term for the the stuff that flies off, because I know fly ash is kind of different with, it's like post coal burning plants, so that's a little different. The stuff that's at the top of these coal train cars, basically, whatever you would call that, and it flies off of
the loose particulate.
Yeah, exactly. And so like they were getting sued. I think it was BNSF at the time when I was was being sued over it getting into the Columbia River. And they just, in the court case, just came out that there's just a significant amount of, if the federal government was going to default to anything, it was going to be benefit of the doubt for the industry. Is that something that you've seen in your experience?
Yes. I've worked with directly with local Ohio EPA folks, but I've also worked with the national EPA folks. Starting when I was in Seattle in 1979, I worked for Patel at Hanford, and one of my first tasks as a young engineer was to determine sites where waste were dumped, and this became a national priorities list later. But more recently, I've worked on a lot of these pesticide cases, and EPA is a regulatory agency for pesticides. And I've had the privilege of looking at thousands of emails and internal documents, both for the Monsanto Roundup and for the Paraquat cases. And I've been in 46 named Roundup cases. And what you find is an uncomfortable collaboration and a revolving door between industry and the regulatory agencies. And so they end up, at times, it seems, losing their ability to be the overseer as well as they should be. My experience also is that they tend not to get super excited about issues until they hit the media. And I could give you many examples of that. So that's unfortunate. And I've always been an industry guy for years and years and years. So it's not like I'm, want to hammer industry, but the reality is that there's a revolving door between people in industry and people in these regulatory positions, and they do look out for each other. At least there's examples of that.
This is a CNN article. They actually were the ones who broke the story about the CDC workers getting sick. They talk about what happened, saying chemicals spilled into the soil and air after this derailment into two small creeks that run through the town. A car carrying flammable vinyl chloride became unstable, sparking fears of a massive explosion. Nearby residents were evacuated while small holes were punched in the rail cars so the vinyl chloride could be channeled into a trench where it was burned. A black mushroom cloud rose over the town and left ash and soot on cars and buildings for miles around. And when you read about that in other articles, they often call it a controlled burn, and that was protocol. Is there a way to control a burn of this nature?
Well, not in my opinion. I made that comment to some news reporter when I was in a ditch, and then it went viral because I called it a lie and an uncontrolled burn. But for your audience, and time will tell as we get discovery, I'm concerned that, well, first of all, when they say there were small holes, I'm here to tell you that they put shaped charges on these tank cars, and I've seen holes as big as 18 inches in diameter. So I don't know what, and then it was sufficient that it blew holes in the opposite side of the car. So There was apparently concern after 3 days. There was concern that one of the 5 vinyl chloride cars was elevating in pressure, and the word went out that it might blow up and then send shrapnel through the town. That's a real concern. But then it was curious to me that they blew all 5 cars up, and then they threw flares in the trench to light this. And what's even more curious is within not much longer than 24 hours, by the 8th, they had removed all that debris, removed the rails, removed the ties, removed the ballast, the gravel that's about 3 feet thick or so, put down new ballast, new rails, new ties on both. There's 2 lines that go through there, about 1,000 feet on each side. And we're running trains. So there's about 50 trains a day that go through there. So it's a very busy route, but they left the contamination under the ballast. So I think that with time, we're going to have to look at and see, one, was that one car really in imminent danger of blowing up? And 2, even if so, why were all 5 blown up when you could have offloaded the other 5, but it would have taken time? And did this end up being mainly an economics decision as opposed to an environmental decision? And I don't have the answers to that, but the timing is very suspect. And we'll know eventually, but we don't know today for sure.
Over on Locals, Wells Mortensen asks, burning of vinyl chloride seems to produce phosgene, a World War I battle gas, which you're talking about. It as a chemical like agent from Agent Orange, for instance, right? Who sanctioned? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the phosgene, that question is partially true. I worked on nerve agent at Battelle for quite some time, but one of the byproducts of especially poor combustion of vinyl chloride is phosgene, and another byproduct is dioxins. Both are at very small percentages. The problem is they're very toxic. And so we did measure for phosgene and dioxins. The problem is a lot of that stuff, when you start sampling the air 2 weeks after the incident and you've had 3 major rain events, the odds of you finding a lot in the air are pretty low. Things are diluted. That's why I was critical of the railroad early on by sampling just with a PID. They call it PID for what they call VOCs, which is sort of just a big grab number. It doesn't measure individual chemicals. And those instruments had no chance of measuring for phosgene or for dioxin. And it wasn't until early March, the EPA had a mobile instrument that measures actual individual chemicals in the air. And they didn't MOB that I want to see the exact date to make sure I get it right. They have a device called a TAG, which is sort of it's called Trace Atmospheric Gas Analyzer, TAGA. And it wasn't mobilized until March 7th, which was a full month afterwards. So one wonders why it took so long, because we all know that things will dilute and dissipate with time, right? So to learn, those initial acute exposures occur right away, right? And then if you don't measure anything like that for a while, the odds of finding it are much less. That's why I spent most of the time looking for what fell on the ground, either in the surface waters or the soils, because I figured that's where it would end up.
So the real part of the question, I think, was who sanctioned creation of an actual WMD in civilian area? And I think, if you take out the WMD part, which the EPA might, or CDC, whatever federal agency is out there working on this stuff, might disagree with that terminology. But let's just say who's in charge of all this? Like, who ultimately makes the decision about doing something like that?
Well, that's the huge question. Is you had everything from the local fire departments, which obviously a rural fire department doesn't have a lot of skill set in this. Then you have the local Ohio EPA. Then you have the federal EPA, and then you have the railroad and any of their contractors. And it's been a bit of a in the Senate testimony. All I can refer to is what's been said publicly in the Senate testimony. But they kind of say they were all in agreement with this, and then there's some effort to kind of pin it on people locally. I suspect one of the problems you have always is that combustion of these complex chemicals takes some expertise. And it doesn't necessarily lie in local EPA or local fire departments, right, to know what the combustion of vinyl chloride produces. So I suspect at the end of the day that the railroad was the one that was pushing for this decision, and then others went along with it. But we won't know for sure. This is the problem, the frustration for everyone. But eventually, when they go through discovery, when they go through the legal process, we'll know exactly who did what to whom. But right now, it's muddled. And but I do know from personal experience that one of the problems you always have is getting the right quality of expertise. I mean, I'm one of the top exposure experts in the United States. Well, I don't think they had somebody of that capability there right away. Now, whether they had them there by the time they make the decision or not, we don't know. But we will know eventually. It'll be very interesting to know whether this was a decision based primarily on economics or based on the environment, or was it truly the case that this car was going to blow up and cause problems. The curious part about that is it's a concept in engineering called BLEVE, a boiling liquid evaporation explosion. And there have been incidents with propane cars, particularly in Arizona, where they've blown up to 1,000 feet away. But appreciate that this environment, the burning or the derailment had been going on for 3 days before they made this decision. And if you look at photographs of where the vinyl chloride cars were, at least some of them, it looks like they're just sort of laying on their sides, and obviously it's a mess. But the question is, why couldn't you have gone in with tanker trucks and offloaded these? It would have been a pain and it would have taken some time. But all of that remains unresolved in terms of knowing why the decisions were made the way they were. But the concept that they're saying they blew small holes in these cars, I'm here to tell you, I've got firsthand photographs of every one of those cars, and they're not small holes. They use
Just wanted to
shaped
let everybody
charges.
know. So sorry, go ahead, Stephen. Didn't
They
mean to
use
cut you off.
they use shaped explosive charges to blow holes in those cars.
So if people want to stay up to date with what you're working on, you are on Rumble at Petty Podcasts. So everybody go check them out. And maybe, Stephen, before we go into a little bit more about this and I take some questions from locals, could you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and why did you decide to go to this particular incident?
Sure. I've been around a long time. I have undergraduate and graduate degrees in chemical engineering at the University of Washington, and then finished first in my class with an MBA way back a long time ago. Started out working at the national lab for a research firm called Patel, became a senior research scientist, then eventually went as a section manager, senior research scientist for Columbia Gas System, and then in 1996, I started working in 79, so that just means I'm old. But in 1996, I created a group called EES Group, and we became a forensics engineering company and ultimately doing disputed claims for the insurance industry. And I ended up writing the textbook for that industry. In fact, the second edition just came out in 22. But as part of that, some of the cases would go to litigation. I got older, so I got involved in those. And then the toxic tort attorneys found me, and I started doing work on Legionella and cases like that. And 400 or so cases later, I've done a whole host of those. So I have kind of an interesting background in what we call a certified industrial hygienist, which is kind of an exposure control expert. And then I'm a certified safety professional and OSHA expert, and then I'm a professional engineer. So there's only about 200 or so of us like that in the United States. The term industrial hygiene is an odd term because it invokes thinking you're at the dentist or something. But what we really do is anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control exposures to people and try to minimize or eliminate them. Or in legal cases, I go backwards and try to figure out what actually happened to the person and how bad was it and what could have been done to stop it. As far as what happened here was, I spent most of my career in Ohio. I'm spoiled now that I spend half my time in South Florida and half the time in Ohio. You can guess what time of year where. And I'm still president of a coin club up in Central Ohio, and I'm on the board of a special needs autistic high school as well. And so I was up there for 2 meetings. Got a call from one of the large legal outfits that I work for, Simmons Hanley Conroy, out of Alton, Illinois, New York City, saying, "Have you retired?" And I said, "Well, not exactly." And they said, "You're the best. We'd really like to have you up there in East Palestine." And I said, "Well, okay, I'll do it, representing the folks." I said, "The question, of course, is going to be figuring out what to sample for and where, and then also getting all the equipment and media together in a matter of a few days to do that." And so that's got a call on the evening of the 15th of February, and by the 20th, we were moving to the site up in East Palestine.
On YouTube, Fred is asking, does your guest know if the Army Corps of Engineers have a statement on this event?
To my knowledge, no. There has been some sampling in the Ohio River because I think they found some butyl acrylate downstream. They probably would only be involved if there was concerns about major contamination, maybe of the water supply. But even there, I think it would be local municipalities that would be dealing with that. But I haven't seen any report from the Corps of Engineers.
Kristen, Megan TV, as a fellow industrial hygienist and environmental specialist, my biggest concern is these toxicants are known to be absorbed into breast milk. When in EP, I tasted and smelled the hazards. Any comment on that?
No, I'd say hi to Kristen. It's really going to depend on the specific contaminants and their concentrations, and we do know those. We just haven't done the full evaluation and the risk to determine whether they exceed risk levels, et cetera. So that's what I'm in the middle of doing now. The concern will, the situation we're in is I don't want to say the sky is falling. On the other end, I don't want to say that everything's fine. So as a scientist and one who's done this for a very long time, it's important that I make sure before we put the results out and the interpretation of those that we've done a thorough analysis of what the results are and what they mean. And the what they mean part is what's going on right now.
Davina Duckworth, I'm very curious about those soil and air water sample findings. Is it possible to tamper or alter them?
I guess the answer would be sure. But not with respect to the folks. The only tampering would be if somehow or other I tampered with them in terms of taking the samples or getting them sent out, or if the lab were to do that. We worked with a firm called Eurofins, and I worked with 4 labs across the United States. There was literally hundreds of messages and conversations back and forth as to what to do, how to sample, how to preserve, what analysis to run, what analysis to report. I think the biggest question, of course, will be when litigation occurs, which is likely, that people will heavily scrutinize the chain of custodies and all of that, as is their right. And any little mistake we make, of course, will be pointed out. But we tried to be very careful, although it's hard when you're doing hundreds and hundreds of containers.
Another thing that Nathaniel Kelly is saying, more of a statement, but maybe you could respond to it. It's also important for people to understand the persistence of the chemical compounds that are present. These chemicals will settle on surfaces, then be drawn back into the air and redistributed.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I'll give you 2 anecdotal stories of when I was there. I got a call in the middle of sampling. It took many years to get it approved. There's a hazardous waste incineration facility in East Liverpool, Ohio, which is probably 30 or 40 miles from there. And some of the waste were being trucked right away to that facility for incineration. And I got a call from the mayor, who was getting a lot of pressure about, that from his citizens, concerned that that maybe they were getting, contaminated. And he said, I want you to say that that's a great facility or something to that effect. And I said, I have no issue with the facility. I said, I've followed that for decades. I said, but you're not going to like the other two answers I'm going to give you. And he said, what's that? And I said, first of all, to run the facility properly, you have to characterize the waste. You have to know what's in it so that you know how long to hold it at what temperature in order to make sure that everything that's in it gets combusted and burned and it doesn't come out the stack. And I'm not sure they've characterized these wastes. And at that point, I was the only one sampling for dioxins. I didn't know if they were in or were not, but they certainly were plausible. And the second point that I made is, it's kind of like when you have your lawn mowed by these lawn care companies and they throw everything in the back and they run down the freeway or the highway, and by the time they get to the landfill, everything's on the road, right? That's an exaggeration. But I said, these trucks are running out of there and they're not sealed. And debris, mud from the tires, dust from the bins, the cargo, is being distributed wherever they go. And I said, be it that it's diluted and it's lower concentrations, but if in fact there's dioxin in these trucks at levels that's unacceptable, that's not a good thing. Curiously enough, on February 26th, I didn't even know it, but I found it in writing my report that the EPA shut down transportation of trucks off site because they were taking trucks out by the dozens, as well as frac tanks. These are tanks that hold contaminated water. And now I've noticed they're put two huge tanks on site where I'm not sure they're moving the water anymore. It's being stored in huge storage tanks. The first time that they measured dioxins was the Indiana firm in Indiana, where they were taking some of these soil waste measured, and they did find dioxins, but they said they were low. There's some critique about whether they're really low or not. I will tell you, we found levels higher than that. We found some low, but we found some higher, and we were one of the first groups to actually sample the stockpiles on site and the soils underneath the railroad tracks, et cetera. So the point I'm making to answer Nathaniel's question is that the other thing they were doing is Taggart Road was the main road kind of where things went up and down. It was closed to most traffic, but the trucks coming in and out of there, even our car was just loaded with mud. I can't tell you how muddy and awful conditions were. But those trucks were tracking it down the road. And then they had a street cleaner with throwing water on it, but you could see dust everywhere. So, I mean, it's kind of like trying to stop mosquitoes with a soccer net. I know they're trying to do something, but I don't think it was super effective. But the big issue on all of that is I think the desire was to get all that stuff moved off site as quick as possible. But I think the problem with that is that it's a well-known concept in hazardous waste that you've got to characterize the waste before you start to transport it. So you transport it properly, and then also that you dispose of it properly. In other words, different facilities and different landfills can take different types of waste. So I don't think the waste was, my big criticism early on was I didn't think that the tests that needed to be run to characterize the wastes as well as the contaminated areas had been done. And our job, and I think we were one of the first, and certainly the independent first, to try to figure that out.
There was a question from somebody watching on ROKFIN about your statement. I think that you can safely burn chemicals, but perhaps it wasn't done appropriately in this circumstance. But they were questioning, how could you possibly burn chemicals safely?
You can. All chemicals have a carbon-hydrogen backbone. So ideally, if you combusted, I try to use this example on poor combustion. It won't be a completely correct example, but the simplest hydrocarbon is really methane, CH4. And if you burn it with the right amount of oxygen, it converts to carbon dioxide and water. But if you burn it poorly, you starve it for oxygen, you get carbon monoxide. And typically when you don't fully saturate with oxygen in a combustion process, you get a lot of soot and you get incomplete combustion products. And those incomplete combustion products are almost always more toxic than complete combustion products. So for example, if you burn methane perfectly well, you don't get any carbon monoxide. But if you burn it poorly, you see an orange or yellow flame rather than a blue flame. You know you're making CO. So the same thing can be done in these incinerators. The difference is there's chlorine and fluorine atoms on some of these hydrocarbons. And so two things that have to happen. One, you have to combust the hydrocarbon backbone down to ideally CO2 and water. And then you will get some acid gases, HCl, HF, that come off, and you have to have a cleanup train on the end, sorbers, et cetera, that will clean up that material. But the key component of all of this is to know what it is you're combusting so you can have the right ratios of fuel to oxygen and the right cleanup streams on the back end to clean up whatever comes off this process. And without the characterization, that's hard to know.
Okay, Stephen, let's take a question over on locals. I'm going to go down to the first one here. What does vinyl chloride smell like? DMC wants to know.
That is a good question. Let me see if I've got the answer for you, because I've got a whole series of stuff on the properties of each of these chemicals. I don't know right off the top of my head. It's defined as a colorless gas or liquid with a sweet odor. So kind of would be kind of like a gasoline odor, but not as sharp. I guess that's the best way. Benzene is known as a constituent that has a sweet odor as well. I don't know if people have ever smelled benzene. Hopefully not too much, but it's defined as having a sweet odor. Now, I will say that the odors that I smelled out there weren't sweet. They had an odd odor. They had a sweetness to it, but it was also pungent, more of a pungent odor. So, that's what I'm looking at now, is where I smelled the odors the strongest. I'm looking at the analytical to try to figure out what that might have been.
There was actually an interesting question on Rumble right now. Why is the CDC at something like this anyway? At a train crash site, Center for Disease Control, they're exceeding their mandate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would have expected somebody like ATSDR, American, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is kind of more the research arm, where they go in later and will try to determine health effects from exposures. I'm not sure why the CDC is there. They're certainly there pretty late. But yeah, I would have expected the ATSDR to be the agency that would have shown up rather than CDC. So I don't have a good answer for them.
Okay, Brisbille, the government, federal, state, and local have proven themselves untrustworthy. Why should anyone put faith in what they say? What do you think about that?
Well, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm sure, for this comment, but I always tell my friends, there's exceptions to everything I say, of course, but I said, if you're a world-class scientist, do you go to work for a local EPA or whatnot, or do you work for a university or a major lab or even an industrial lab? And so there are certainly good people in these agencies. I'm not trying to smear everybody, but I said, by and large, you don't have the most talent, in my opinion, in those agencies. And so that shows up eventually in a scenario like this, especially where the incident occurs in a very rural community. The local Ohio EPA, the local fire people, and not to criticize them at all, they may even been volunteer firemen. There's no way that they would probably have the capacity, unless you were just lucky, to know that vinyl chloride combusts to dioxin or phosgene or things like that. So, and the real question is, and we don't know the answers, are who was really driving the decision making? I touched on that earlier. Mm-hmm. It's my sense that the railroad was, but that has yet to be confirmed. I think the other folks went along with their decisions to blow up these 5 vinyl chloride cars, and then the resulting contamination that occurred. But until we get this, what we call discovery, to really know who did what to whom and who was involved, then we'll know these answers. But the real problem is that it's not unusual that a lot of the folks, like for instance, they had a major environmental firm there were mirroring me, for lack of a better term. Whenever I would sample, they would sample or whatnot. I've been doing this 40 some years. This person couldn't have been more than in their 20s, and constantly was asking me what I was doing and why I was doing it, and slow down. And major firm, but the person there wasn't a senior person at all. And this is not unusual. The companies hire a major firm and somebody gets sent out that's a very junior person. So I'm sure that if I had a conversation with that person on all the chemistry, I would have totally confused them.
Sounds like they sent out a producer from one of my old newsrooms, or journalists. Same thing happening, cheaper and younger. Okay, Wells Mortensen has a couple questions, so let's start with number one. First, thanks, Mr. Petty, for being a witness in all the class action lawsuits. Number one, for us who left the chemistry classes behind in high school, could you please magnify the cost of performing a water and/or soil safety test for industrial poisons?
Yeah, that's. I know I did. There was some media where I said something to the effect that they probably spent 20 to 30,000 on Analytical at that point, and people just thought that was outrageous, and for doing simple SVOCs or VOCs. But what they didn't appreciate was I wasn't doing just simple SVOCs and VOCs. I was also looking specifically at specific VOCs like vinyl chloride, et cetera. And then I was doing dioxins. And when you start to, to give you an example, on any given location, assuming that I was sampling not only the soil, but pulling the sediments out of the creek and doing the water, I would have 14 containers for the soils and 10 for the water. All those jars are labeled. All of them are going in for different analytical. And so the cost to do this is tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. So it is expensive, but we're not just doing standard off-the-shelf analysis. I mean, some of those are included, but we were doing very specific analysis. In fact, there were a number of PhDs involved in coming up with sorbent tubes for sampling for dioxin in the air. And this took almost a week and a half. So it's pretty complicated. With you showed earlier that list of chemicals, and so it's not inexpensive. That's why a lot of homeowners, et cetera, want to have their water tested, et cetera. Well, unless they're a shallow well or surface water, I'm not sure in the short term that's all that constructive. Plus, it's expensive. I'd be more concerned about them planting a garden or having people play in the grass or whatnot. Now, if we clear all these areas and it turns out there's not a problem, then so be it. It's just at the time I was being asked those questions, we didn't have the answers to those questions.
The follow-up to that first one was that, okay, so you're one of the residents there and you want to have a clear conscience about potable drinking water costs in US dollars. Feel free to elucidate on both lab tests and supplies needed. So basically, okay, you're somebody who lives there and you want to ensure that at least in the short term, before these results come in, that you are not drinking water that is going to make you sick. I think the question is, what kind of cost are you looking at? What would go into that? Would you just buy bottled water from the store, or say you want to hook your system up to something that would take these chemicals out of it? I think just kind of, big picture, what I would assume is part of the question is, can the average person afford to ensure their safety in a situation like this?
My answer is no. It's just straight out no. They're better off in the short term to drink bottled water and don't get distilled water, get water with minerals in it. But no, I don't. If they were going to do the full spectrum of analysis that I did, it would not be practical for most people to afford to do that.
Okay. Question 2, are you aware of commercial services that would provide water and soil purity tests for farmers buying new land? Is aim there is to establish true worth of land bought anew without a provable history of use beforehand when planning to produce organically? That's really an interesting question. So yeah, I guess if you're somebody who relies on the quality of the soil, for instance, to do your job, are you just screwed at this point? I mean, you're a farmer, and like, can you ever sell your land for agricultural purposes? It's just an interesting question.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of different answers to it. Um, I do think, regardless of how this all turns out, that the local people's inherently their property values are diminished simply because of all the negative press, right? It's going to take a long time for that. Even if everything was perfect, it'll take a long time for that to pass over. I'm sure it is. With respect to sampling, it turns out that, and I could be off on this, but there's really only two major players in the United States. They've gobbled up most of the other labs. Um, and the one, interestingly enough, I started off with some old friends, getting all the methods lined up and all the containers, and then this was on the 16th and 17th, and I was told by a senior vice president had gone up the line and that they would not analyze our samples, couldn't work with us because they were under an agreement with the railroad. So that kind of was odd. I said, well, you're just analyzing samples. Who do you care where they come from? So then I went to a second firm called Eurofins, who I wasn't really that familiar with, but they bought up a lot of operations, and they're the second biggest. Well, I don't know if they're the second biggest, but there's really only two players. And they did the same thing. We went through the whole extra. I said, can't work with you. We're under exclusivity with the railroad. I was like, this is ridiculous. I mean, I can't get my samples analyzed. And this went on for 4 days. I finally went up the line. I went up the line at both places, and I finally got, thank goodness, somebody very high up at Eurofin said, we'll analyze your samples to you. I said, I'm working for the folks. We need a lab. And but that took me from the 15th to the 20th to get a lab that would actually work with us. But so I would say that Eurofins is the lab I use. They're obviously, I think they did a great job in terms. We ended up, when I say a lab, I ended up working with 5 different locations around the United States. Can't remember them all, but Arizona, California, Virginia, Ohio, all different labs for different analysis and different methods and media. So, but as far as sampling the soil or the water, that can be done. For instance, if you want to sample for dioxins and it's water, you get 2 brown 2-liter jars, you fill them up with the water, and you send them in under ice and ask for 8290 dioxins is the method. So, and then there are similar designations for volatiles and chemicals. But when I sent in the volatiles, I was very specific. I said, not only do I want your normal scan for volatile organic compounds, but I want vinyl chloride, ethyl glycol, monobutyl ether, ethyl hexyl acrylate, isobutylene, butyl acrylates, phosgene, dioxins, and furans. So I didn't ask for the standard VOC analysis. I wanted VOCs, plus I wanted to see the peaks on all these. And I did the same thing on SVOC, semi-volatile compounds. So it wasn't, there was, as I said before, I got some criticism that I was spending so much money on analytical. Well, the problem is a lot of these standard methods don't sample for a lot of these specific compounds. You have to specify them, and it requires more work. But it can be done. I mean, if you had a big farm and you want to know, you'd probably be worth it if you really wanted peace of mind to do that. Probably would be, you probably could justify that. But for an individual homeowner, it gets expensive, especially in rural communities.
I was muted. Sorry. Thank you for this in-depth info. W says, I just subscribed to Steven's Rumble channel. Just a reminder, everybody, he is on Rumble at Petty Podcast. So go check him out. Back to a couple more questions from locals. The important information that honest regulators, hang on, let me just pull this here. would include what are the chemicals of concern, e.g., what was on the train that was released or created by adding water or by burning. 2, what is an acceptable exposure standard chosen for these chemicals, against which the test results would be compared. And 3, what are the appropriate tests to find the chemicals of concern, e.g., are they sensitive enough to measure concerning levels of the chemical? Would sampling technique hide high concentration, perhaps by aggregating samples to high hits by dilution? The party that is liable for paying for the cleanup may not mind if the expert misses a problem that the residents will suffer with for years. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it sounds like we got a chemist here. Let's answer them real quickly. The chemicals of concern are, I think I just went through them that I was interested in, so I'm not going to repeat that.
Okay.
The acceptable exposure standards, that's what I'm looking at. I'm in the middle of doing that right now, but my inclination is to look at EPA screening level values for soils, waters, etc. And then, of course, the question is to use, there are different screening level criteria, and the question is which ones to use. For a carcinogen, you can use one incremental disease in a million called 10 to the minus sixth, or 1 in 100,000, 10 to the minus fifth. For non-carcinogens, the chemical can be both, but they always classify them in either as a carcinogen or non-carcinogen. As a non-carcinogen, there's this factor called hazard quotient, and you can, if it's over 1, typically that's bad. Although there are criteria where if it's over 0.1, it's considered unacceptable. So you have some screening criteria, and I will probably use those ultimately to look at individual values. Now, dioxin's a little bit different animal. The dioxins and furans aren't just, when you say dioxins, it's not one chemical. It's literally approaching 20 chemicals. And so each one is weighted based on its toxicity, if you will. And they call it the total equivalent value you calculate, and then that comes up with an aggregate number. You can look at the individual constituents as well, and I've done that, as to whether any of them are above screening level values. But then you also look at the aggregate of all of them. And so when you say dioxins, you can end up with an individual number, a total equivalent value number. But that's why, and then you compare that to what is considered to be acceptable values. Mm-hmm. As far as the techniques, I was very concerned about that. The biggest issue sometimes is you have one thing that hits high, and then it's impossible to see the things that are lower. We didn't see too much of that. The dioxins I'm measuring in terms of nanograms per kilogram. So, parts per million is 1 part in a million, or and then parts per billion is called picograms, and then nanograms is 1 times 10. It's a million, 1/millionth of a million. So we're measuring the dioxin components at very, very low levels, and if they're there, we find them. As far as the other constituents, we're generally measuring them in micrograms, unless they really have high hits where we see them in milligrams. So parts per billion is usually what we're seeing at a minimum, and parts per trillion we're seeing for the dioxin constituents. So we're going to see them.
Okay, I think that's it. Would sampling technique hide high concentration, perhaps by aggregating samples to hide high hits by dilution? Any thought on that, I guess?
Sampling techniques at high concentrations. No, because we're measuring them at very low concentrations. So we're not going to miss that. If anything, what happens is the lab is smart about that. What they do is if it blows the instrument, in other words, they feed it in there and there's a constituent that just has a very high peak, they have enough material to go back and dilute the sample by a factor of 10 or 100 or whatever to then go back and then analyze it again. So the lab has methods to address high, if you have a sample where it's just too high, to dilute it and then measure it again.
Um, Shadow Kane asks on YouTube, though I can't pull it up for some reason because it was a while ago and I didn't see it. But thanks for the super chat. Just one diagnostics company, every quote cancer-causing product more than what's sold go out of date and can't go into a dumpster unless polymerized / made solid / gel. Then it's okay for dumpster landfill for decades. Thoughts on that? Do you have any thoughts on that? I have a bug flying around.
Yeah, I think what they're referring to is for certain constituents that are really toxic, they don't want them to move. In other words, they don't want them to leach or get, rainwater or whatever, get in and leach them out so they can get out. And so what he's talking about is a concept called encapsulation, I think, which means simply that you put a material around it that sort of binds the material up and keeps it from getting dissolved or moving, at least moving as quickly. And I think that's what he's referring to. And what he's saying is that certain materials require that and require certain facilities to do that. That's what I was referring to earlier about characterizing the waste, because certain facilities can take certain types of waste and other facilities might. There are other facilities that can either take higher or worse wastes and or they segregate them in a certain part of the facility and they treat them differently. So I think that's what the viewer is asking about is, isn't it true that you would have to segregate some waste depending on the toxicity? And that's true. And that was the heart of the question I had, which was when you start shipping this stuff off and you haven't fully, in my opinion, fully characterized it, then you're kind of dropping this to some of these facilities without them knowing what they're receiving. And that's why I was curious. I didn't hear it publicly, but I saw it when I followed up doing my report on the timeline that on February 26th, EPA stopped all transport off that site. Now, I don't know, I think it's back open again, but I haven't really, I'm not in contact with EPA to know exactly when they've turned things back on and to what extent. I do know that they're storing large volumes of contaminated water on site now.
What I read into the question is basically that like there's these cancer-causing products in some cases can't go in a dumpster unless something's done to them. Then all of a sudden it's okay for them to go into a landfill for decades. Meaning, is it really okay? Because they put the okay in quotes, like it's okay to just dispose of it at that point. And I think might be wondering your thoughts on that. Like, is it really safe to dispose of this stuff in the way that it is once, for instance, it's polymerized or made solid, or are we getting hosed on that too? It's not really safe to just throw this stuff in landfills. And in other words, like we're talking about a particular incident right now, but are we generally speaking having inappropriate or potentially hazardous disposal of serious toxics all over the place?
Yeah, you're going to get me into some philosophy real quick, but
we don't have to.
We never in my field, we never declare a chemical safe. It's just the degree to which it's toxic, because it's been my experience over 40 years that with the exception of one material that I'm aware of, the regulatory limits of all chemicals have dropped with time or stayed constant. They have never gone up. So that just means with better instrumentation and better studies, we find that things are more toxic than we thought they were in the past. Now, a couple of thoughts. I came out of a research institute, and it was always embarrassing when I wrote a paper in a new area that all of a sudden you were like, God, I mean, that was just grabbed and used in ways that were embarrassing almost. I did an early paper on combustion in '82 that got used over and over again. But I always felt like somebody came up with this idea out of the EPA in the 70s. This is when I started, that we're going to make these landfills where we make them really sealed up and we throw the stuff in there and we keep it away from everybody forever. And I always kidded everybody, even early on, and I said, well, they seem to be ignoring the second law of thermodynamics, which is that all things tend towards randomness. In other words, things always get out. It's just not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how much. And moreover, you leave the problem for future generations. I kid people when you go to certain cities like Chicago and St. Louis, that the tallest objects in the whole city is the landfills. So philosophically, I'm I'm not necessarily a fan of landfills. I wish we would deal with the waste, either destroy it or convert it or do something so that we don't leave that problem for others. It costs some money. It's cheaper just to dump it. But the truth of the matter is it will get out. It's just a matter of how much and how fast. The idea is to keep that rate low. But I think the concept that it's going to stay there forever is going against fundamental laws of thermodynamics. But what's curious is somebody made a decision at EPA early on that we were going to take all hazardous waste, not all, some of them are incinerated, but most hazardous waste, we're going to put them in, or waste in general, we're going to put them in these landfills. And to me, it's just delaying dealing with the problem. But that's somebody that's old and opinionated at this point, I guess.
Okay. Kenny Eagle asks, out of the multitude of podcasts and broadcasts since the spill, I've heard various levels of alarm over the toxicity of the environment in East Palestine. One went so far as to say that J.D. Vance, who appeared there only days after the spill, would most certainly have adverse health consequences within the next 5 to 10 years or so because of it. Do you think that's a possibility? Also, how many days had elapsed between the spill and when you arrived on site?
Let me answer the last one first. The initial derailment and spills occurred on February 3rd. The blowing up of the 5 vinyl chloride cars and the uncontrolled burn, in my opinion, and the release to the environment of what didn't burn occurred on the 6th. I showed up on the 21st, or just over 2 weeks later, 15 days later. So I was there a bit later, but I was, to my knowledge, we were the first group to test for dioxins on the 21st. And the next time somebody tested for them, I think, was on March 4th in Indiana. And I know now that beginning in after the first week or so of March, that supposedly railroads contractors testing for dioxins. As far as toxicity and long-term effects, I don't have an answer. The chemicals that cause acute effects like sore throats and things like that, as long as the acute exposure level isn't sufficient to seriously damage systems or organs, then you probably recover from that. For instance, one of the big off gases from combusting vinyl chloride is HCl, hydrochloric gas. And as soon as it hits the atmosphere, it finds water in the air and it goes to hydrochloric acid. So it wouldn't have been a surprise to me that people that were under that plume, it turns out that the ideal combustion characteristics are that you get about 30,000 parts per million, or about 3% of the off products are HCl. So now, of course, it gets diluted right away and then it turns into acid. An acid gas. But if you breathe that in, you're going to burn tissue in the respiratory tract from your nose down to your lungs. Now, if it was done really, really badly, it could have permanent damage. But if it's lighter, then you probably recover from it just fine. The longer term effects from things like dioxins or other constituents are yet to be determined. I'm still just getting the data in, let alone analyzing it. But I guess the answer is it's always annoyingly slowed for people to get information back. But I'm here to tell you that you will get information back that tells you the right answer. It's going to take a little bit of time yet.
Okay, let's go. Oh, that was it. Okay, I think we're good. Stephen, any other final thoughts before we go? I really appreciate your taking all the time for us today.
No, I appreciate the chance to chat, and I appreciate you getting the message out, and hopefully we've answered some people's questions to the extent we can. The answer always has been, as I said in public meetings, the state and officials saying that all's clear, basically, I think, especially by the 8th of February, was premature, simply because I said the proper answer is we know some things, but a lot of things we don't know. And that would have been a much better answer to tell the public, in my opinion. And we're still in that boat, although we're getting down the road. We're starting to know I pretty much know what we found. Now I got to figure out what it means.
Okay, everybody go check out Steven's podcast, Petty Podcast on Rumble. The producer has just entered the studio. Hi. A little under the weather, so we made it. We made it. It's time to wrap. Okay, it's time to wrap it up. Thanks everybody for watching. See you next time.